There's never been more hatred and misunderstanding. It'll take decades to fix these problems. It's basically, you can say whatever you want until you make someone who is very powerful very angry, and then they come after you. And I don't know what Putin is doing. He's off in Pink Pony Land. Who knows?
Riley, welcome to the Czech Republic and thank you for accepting my invitation to interview. Could you briefly introduce yourself and tell us how you came to work at the Russian state media outlet Russia Today and why you later left that job?
Well, thank you for having me. Ahoy. It's great to be back in Czechia. Well, briefly, my story is I worked in media in the United States. After finishing university, I became very disillusioned and unhappy with the Obama administration, which I thought was sort of a way to normalize all the worst things about the Bush years. And everyone I knew loved Obama. I hated him, so I decided I'm getting out of America. I hate this place. And I came to Brno. I came to Czechia. And after a few months in Moravia, I actually found a job teaching English in Bashkortostan, which is a republic in the Russian Federation. And I didn't know anything about Russia. I definitely didn't know anything about Bashkortostan. So I moved to Moscow. And originally I was working actually for Press TV, which is an Iranian state media channel in English, which was a very interesting experience. I really enjoyed it. And after that, I got a job at RT International, working for their website for several years. And, you know, I think that, first of all, I want to say I have nothing against state media. I think that even Western state media provides a valuable service, but they all are based on the same concept, which is you take people who are disaffected citizens of a country and they come and work for this foreign, state-run outlet, and they use this outlet as a platform to talk about issues that they're not allowed to talk about in their own country. And RT works the same way, just as Radio Free Europe or Deutsche Welle. It's very, very similar structure, very similar formula. The problem though with this formula is if you're living in the country, I was in Moscow, I was working for RT. And when the pandemic came, what ended up happening is that RT was used as a platform for disaffected, angry, rightfully angry Westerners to complain about the horrible discrimination, the health-destroying policies, the forced vaccinations in their own country. And you weren't allowed to say anything about what was happening inside Russia. Well, I have a Russian son, I live in Russia, I've invested a lot of time in Russia. I want to see a better Russia. I don't want to see my fellow Russians being destroyed by the same policies that are happening in the West, but I can't talk about it for some reason. So anyway, what basically ended up happening is I suggested a story about this, an op-ed. RT said, they initially said okay, and then said no way, we won't even give you changes to make. There's no way you're publishing this. So I ended up quitting and just going on my own and writing about the things that I think are important, which are also very important in the West,
So now you publish as an independent reporter on the Substack platform, and your posts about the ongoing digital transformation in Russia are very surprising for many non-Russian readers. Do you have any idea how much of the Russian public, for example, is capable of any objective view when it comes to the war in Ukraine? And what is the support for government policy in general in Russia at the moment?
Yeah, these are really difficult questions to answer. I think you might get a different answer depending on which Russian you speak to. But from my perspective, and I left Russia in June 2022, so I'd spent a fair amount of time in Russia, when the war started in February 2022. Look, the problem with talking about how to objectively view the war in Ukraine is I think people are asking or thinking about the wrong things. So a really good example would be casualty figures. Like everyone is fighting over how many Russians have been killed, how many Ukrainians have been killed. Of course, this is very important, but it ignores a larger issue that is much more important, which is, has the special military operation accomplished its stated objectives? And if not, then the war is not going well. And if it has, then it's going well. Look, a war by itself has no more value, right? The point of a war, it's politics by other means. So the situation after the war has to be better than it was before the war. Otherwise, it was a stupid war. In my opinion, and I think that many Russians would agree, it's not about Russians thinking that they don't have legitimate grievances, legitimate problems, that they've been mistreated. I think many Russians understand that. The question is whether this war has helped fix these problems in Ukraine. Again, in my opinion, and I think there's a lot of evidence that many Russians would agree with this assessment, this war has exacerbated, it's made all the problems that existed pre-February 24th. It's made everything worse, right? Like the so-called demilitarization of Ukraine. Ukraine has never been more militarized, ever. You know, the denazification. Well, okay, I mean, it depends on what you mean by that, but the problem is you capture these, what are considered the main neo-Nazis in Mariupol, and then you trade them back to Ukraine for an oligarch, Viktor Medvedchuk, who very likely is one of the reasons why this war happened. And by the way, Medvedchuk is a close friend of Putin. So that's kind of weird. What else? With stopping NATO from encroaching into Russia's sphere of influence, and Finland just joined NATO. Sweden will probably join NATO. Ukraine might join NATO. And also preventing the creation of a permanent anti-Russia in Ukraine. And this is a very personal one because Ukraine and Russia are just historically, they're brotherly nations. They have close family ties. I mean, my own family, we had relatives in Ukraine, outside of Kiev. There's never been more hatred and misunderstanding. It'll take decades to fix these problems. And so from this perspective, I don't look at this war as who took which village and how long it took. It's irrelevant at this point. And if anyone thinks that, Russia is going to take Kiev next week, I don't know where you get this evidence from, and what would it accomplish? How would it fix these problems? There's no military solution to the problems in Ukraine. And the Russian government understood that for 8 years, in my opinion. I mean, if personally, I think they should have just fixed the problem in 2014, but whatever, it's too late for that. There's no military solution to these problems. There are problems. There are ones, we should be listening more closely to what Moscow says about these problems. But the solution that Moscow has come up with is not fixing these problems. And so it's a terrible tragedy for brotherly Slavs, and it's really painful to watch this play out. And I'm very worried, I'm worried for Russia, I'm worried for Ukraine. And I feel like many Russians would give you a similar answer to that.
Yeah. Before we move on to the topic of digital transformation, I have one question about Russian independent media. It struck me that the Russian alternative media is much more critical of the government than the Western media, which tends to have a more pro-Russian profile. What do you make of this discrepancy?
Yeah, well, okay, so just to begin with, I want to say that I think that the Westerners have their perception of how media and information works in Russia, I think, is very distorted. Actually, you're allowed to criticize the government in Russia. You're allowed to write articles talking about how, their vaccines aren't safe and effective, or digitalization is bad. You're allowed to make these very harsh criticisms.
Are you allowed to say word war?
Okay, so there's an interesting example. So the problem in Russia, but it's not unique to Russia, is that there's arbitrary rules, rules that can be applied in an arbitrary way. And even with the word war, it's very interesting because there have been cases where people call what's happening in Ukraine a war, and they get fined, or they get fined for criticizing the war. This has happened. There's documented cases. But if you're the right person, if you're considered a good Russian, you're allowed to call it a war. You're allowed to criticize the war. There's certain people who are allowed to criticize it, certain people who are not. Many, many examples of this. I mean, I could make a list for you guys. But this way that information and media works in Russia is not so different from in the West. It's basically, you can say whatever you want until you make someone who is very powerful very angry. And then they come after you, right? And so in this sense, the freedom of speech, of course, doesn't exist, but restrictions are arbitrary, right? And it's very similar to how other countries' media systems work in that sense. But there are many excellent independent media outlets in Russia that are not sanctioned by the Russian government. They're not considered foreign agents. They're patriotic. Some of them are socialist. Some of them are very heavily influenced by the Russian Orthodox Church. And they provide excellent information about real issues inside Russia. So getting though to your question about, why is it that sometimes in Western sort of non-mainstream media, you have this, this sort of pro-Russia view, or Russia is sort of presented as an alternative to what Brussels and Washington offer. I think this is a very human way of viewing the world, right? It's the grass is always greener on the other side. Like, because Moscow and Washington are in conflict and we hate Washington, Moscow is the good guy. Or we prefer Moscow. And I get it. Look, I was that person for a very long time. And in some ways I still am that person, really. The problem though is, at the end of the day, it looks like all the governments of the world want to do the same things to us, And so when you think about it like that, like what's actually in my interest? And if you are someone who really feels strongly about, Russia as a force of good for the world, you should encourage the Russian government to do good things and to stop doing bad things to their own people, And that's how I view that issue. And I would just encourage people to not get stuck in this false binary where you have to choose Washington or Moscow. Why not just choose yourself? Choose your friends, choose your family. We're the pros. We're way down here and they're way up there. And I don't see why we should have to choose a side. We should just choose us,
I just have to ask, what's up with Prigozhin? I must admit that from our point of view, it's really hard to understand what was really going on about the so-called coup.
Yeah, well, I wish I could give you a definitive answer. I don't think anyone really knows, but I'll tell you what I think is happening, or some clues that might help us understand what happened. It's very important when we're talking about Prigozhin to understand that what happened on June 24th, it's the result of months of conflicts with the Russian Defense Ministry, specifically with Shoigu, the defense minister. And I'm sure in Czechia you guys saw the videos of Prigozhin standing in front of a pile of dead bodies and pointing to them and saying, where's the boop, ammo, Shoigu, like screaming, yelling. And he would do this almost daily for weeks. There was many disagreements between Wagner, which is a PMC, a private military company, and the defense ministry in Russia over supplies, logistics, accusations that the Russian military was that there's too much corruption in the Russian military and it wasn't functioning properly, and Prigozhin was upset about this and wanted some changes. So what happened, I think, basically is Shoigu, or the defense ministry, they signed an order saying, we're closing Wagner down. We're going to incorporate them into the Russian, they are signing contracts with the defense ministry, and it was all supposed to happen by July 1st. So Shoigu was basically saying, Wagner's done, we're wrapping this up, they're out of line. And Prigozhin was saying Shoigu and the Russian Defense Ministry are corrupt and we're losing the war because of them. That's basically what he's been saying for, I don't know, 3 months. So when you put what happened into in this context, there is some logic to it. It didn't come out of nowhere. It was still a crazy thing to see happen. But you start to understand that there's this really strange, there's just these different factions clearly in Russia at the highest levels. And I think that Prigozhin probably represents one of these factions and Shoigu represents the other. And I don't know what Putin is doing. He's off in Pink Pony Land. Who knows, who gives him his information or what he knows or doesn't know, or if he can even change anything. And but what was most interesting about, in my opinion, about what happened with this march on Moscow was that the Russian military showed almost no resistance. There was unfortunately some casualties, but for the most part, they were able to just ride their tanks 200 kilometers to Moscow. But what is also very interesting is I am very suspicious of this idea. There's some theories, for example, that it was maybe somehow coordinated with Putin and et cetera, et cetera. I find this to be very unconvincing just for the reason that I think we're starting to see purges within the Russian military. So there's a very influential general, Surovkin, Popov, another one who was either fired or resigned recently, and he put out a very interesting video message saying there's huge problems in the Russian military, Russian soldiers aren't being rotated, and according to some reports, a third general was recently released from duty or resigned or fired. And I think that Shoigu is really scared now, and he is targeting people that he thinks might supported Prigozhin directly or indirectly. And it's clear that in the Russian military itself, no one wanted to stop Wagner. How did they get so close to Moscow? So it raises a number of really interesting questions, and what happens to Prigozhin, I don't know. They say that he's in Belarus. We don't know exactly what he's doing. But I really think that what Prigozhin did is the beginning of probably a long series of internal problems for Russia. I don't see how Moscow emerged better, more secure from this. It seems like the system is quite fragile at this point.